You're listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. For more information, find us on Instagram at Decidedly Podcast.
Welcome to Decidedly. Today we're talking with Ryan Goulart from Think2Perform. He hosts the Think2Perform podcast, Making the Ideal Real, and the co-author of Leveraging Your Financial Intelligence at the Intersection of Money, Health, and Happiness with Doug Lennick, our friend who we talked to a while back on the podcast. Ryan and Doug work together at Think2Perform, providing great insight and value in executive coaching that focuses on alignment, fulfillment of values, and decision-making, really right up our alley. I have implemented personally, and I know Sean has too, as a professional in our capacity as financial advisors, a lot of the teachings from Think2Perform. So it was a real treat to be able to talk with Ryan and learn a little bit more about how they have come to their conclusions on different ideas and get some helpful tips on how to implement those ideas towards a journey to improving our own consciousness, our self-awareness, and our alignment in life. So there's a lot that we talk about. We really get into decision-making and implementing the 4 R's. We'll talk about that in the podcast. I want to give you a little bit of background so it makes sense, because all three of us, we kind of get into a rut speaking our own language and forget that not everybody else has gone through the same work that we have. But the 4 R's is a component of the behavioral financial advisor designation that Think2Perform provides and teaches. And the 4 R's speak specifically to recognizing, reflecting, reframing, and responding. So those are the steps that we would go through anytime we're at a point of high emotion. An event happens to us, something occurs, and we've got to make a decision. I hope that you learned something from our conversation today. Without waiting too much longer, let's get into it.
Originally, you got a degree in neuroscience. Is that what Sanger was telling me?
Yeah, that's correct.
So how did you go from a degree in neuroscience to working for executive consulting and leadership consulting firm?
Interesting story. One that I guess I'll start with. My mom is a social worker, and throughout my family life, it was I had always an interest in science, and I had always an interest in people and why people do what they do. And as I was going through school at Stonehill College, which is a small liberal arts school south of Boston, I just followed my curiosity, really. I have a curious mind. I was really interested in learning more about science. I was interested in learning more about psychology. And the two blended together to what became a neuroscience degree. And thankfully, Stonehill College is one of the few schools that actually does have a degree in neuroscience. And as I was graduating, my now wife lives here in Minnesota. And she was thinking, you know what? It would be a good idea for her to move back home to Minneapolis. And that's what I did too. So I'm from Connecticut originally. And when I first started to look for work, it was one of those things that I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I had a neuroscience degree. I'm coming out of college, and a lot of my peers went to graduate school. They went to further their education on the science side. And I'm a people person. I didn't want to be stuck in a lab and learning about cells, which fascinate me, but not to the point where I want my cells to be my friends. And I went to interview around and found my way talking to Doug because my wife is his youngest daughter. And I was wondering, I was like, well, he's like, what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, I'm not sure. But this has always been a passion of mine. I've always been kind of fascinated by decision making. And so we started a conversation, and he eventually said, you know what, you should come work with us. And thankfully, I had a choice. I was able to choose between another job or working with my now father-in-law. And I chose this and I've been here ever since.
Makes it tough for them to fire you, That's it.
Exactly.
Did you start working
little job
with them?
security?
Did you start working with them before you were married?
Yeah. So I was the
that's
boyfriend.
Such a risk.
Oh, I rolled the dice.
That is rolling the dice.
Yeah.
You got to be so confident.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was one of those things that I didn't really think of much of it at the time, but now I look back, it's like, wow, Rye, like, well done.
If things go south for you, they go south hard.
Oh, they go really fast.
Yeah, that's a high reward, high risk trade-off there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, you guys ended up writing a book together, Leveraging Financial Intelligence.
Yeah. So
when did that?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that.
The story behind that book is that obviously here at Think2Perform, we are constantly trying to answer two questions. I'm sure your listeners will hear those two questions from Doug's podcast as well. But the two questions are, why do people do what they do? And the second question is it possible for one to be who they'd ideally like to be more often? So the answer to the first question is a little bit more problematic, and that's where we bring in neuroscience, psychology, and in some cases behavioral finance to help us answer the question of why do people do what they do. The second question, is it possible for one to be who they'd ideally like to be more often? The answer is yes, but it also implies that we're not ideal all of the time. And in going out and looking at that, the research on what happiness looks like, and who is happy and why are they happy, we started to unpack a lot of different things and a lot of different stories from individuals that were managing both sides of the equation when it came to money, when it came to their health, and when it came to happiness. Because those that were able to find satisfaction, find happiness, living their values, and the connections they've made to those values, that's really what the story of leveraging your financial intelligence is all about.
What did you guys find was a good definition of happiness? Is it self-reported? Is it whether people identify with being happy? Is it something more than that?
The Think2Perform answer would be that when you are aligned, you're happy. So when you get to align your values with your goals and your goals with your behavior, you're able to achieve happiness. Now, in our research for the book, there were a lot of competing different definitions that were out there. Obviously, there are conversations around, and this is where, because of the money side of the conversation that we were setting out to make with the book, is that those individuals that were operating with salaries in the ranges around $75,000 to $80,000 were able to meet their basic needs, and therefore started to achieve happiness when it came to life fulfillment. So their wellness, their stress level, all of those different things started to impact how they defined happiness.
Sure. I couldn't quote the study, but I'm sure this is familiar to both of y'all. I've heard that somewhere in the range of about $120,000 a year in income, after that, as your income increases, there's no measurable impact on happiness. Was that something that you guys found out to be true?
There's definitely a lot of different stories and a lot of different data points that kind of speak to that. And it's just but what's interesting is that I think there's also a perception that those that have money don't have problems. And people, as you both know, that have money have very different problems than those that might not. And it's just a different way to look at things. But the common denominator, which we found throughout the conversations that we had, was stress, and how people manage stress, and how do you understand stress, and where is it coming from? And there's a lot of different stories there, whether it's from someone who learned a certain behavior from their parents and replicated that in their own family, and to their own spending behavior, to all of these different things that impacted how they viewed money and the behavior that was associated with it.
So when it comes to the work that you guys have done with the behavioral financial advisor designation, a lot of the things that you're saying as far as aligning your values, goals, and actions, it sounds familiar to Sean, and it sounds familiar to me because we implement those things as we've learned them through getting that designation and all of the work that you guys have done. Well, what have you seen on your side as one of the biggest impacts of that work? Because I'm only seeing my, anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question, and I think for your listeners as they are hearing this, there's at times, as many people do, you get sucked into your own language. So I'll break it down a little bit to help people understand what we're talking about here. And what we're talking about here are understanding 3 areas of your life. You're understanding your ideal self, which is basically understanding your values, and your values are those things that on your best day you're going to be living those. Mine happen to be integrity, family, health, achievement, and excellence. So on Ryan's best day, those are the values that I'm going to be living. Then there's their personal and your professional, and in your case, financial goals that align to those values. So if today was the second day since the pandemic started that I actually went to the gym. And full disclosure, it was a rude awakening to living my value of health. It was just like the habits weren't there. It just I had to learn some of the workouts I used to do, and then had to dial back the weight, which you see all these like big men walking around the gym, and where their like arms are bigger than their legs, and I'm like thinking to myself, I'm like, wow, this is such an interesting thing. But it was a goal of mine to get back to the gym, and it was a goal of mine to want to get that habit back into life, and that's on the behavioral side. So I have to get on our third frame, the real self. I need to be on my best day. I need to live my values consistent with my goals and align my behavior, which is my reality, to my goals and my values. So I was happy to be able to get to do that today. And there are a lot of different studies and research out there that suggest that you start to make those healthy choices, and it creates a cascade. So you don't go for the burger, you go for the salad, and just to manage your health a little better. And that's part of what made leveraging your financial intelligence at the intersection of money, health, and happiness so important, because we all get those choices every day, and they become so automatic. So when we think about automatic decisions that we had to learn, I mean, you look at driving, for example. I mean, that skill of driving now is so automatic. We don't even have to think about it. It's just once we get in the car, you put the seatbelt on, you know how to turn left and turn right. But if you start to reflect back on who you were as you were learning to drive, a regular car, a Mini Cooper, would have felt like a boat. It's just it was such a different experience I remember I was driving with my mom, and she was trying to teach me how to drive. I don't know why. It was a bad selection to drive with my mom, because it was, I don't know if I wanted to learn from her, but I remember being so close to the mailboxes, and she was freaking out. But that was it was a learned behavior, and you started to learn. So that's half the reason why I have a neuroscience degree, is because I'm just fascinated by behavior. And
it's interesting. It's such an automatic. You talk about driving, and there is I was reading something the other day, and they were talking about that very issue. And they had an experiment where they asked people to simulate changing lanes. Just the simplest of driving maneuvers. And so, if you're in one lane, you're in the left lane, you want to go the right. So people would turn their hands to the right, and then they turn their hands to the left, which is actually not what you do. You turn your hands to the right, you turn back to the left, and then you turn to the right again to correct. And nobody got that right. And yet it's the simplest thing we do. So it's so automatic that it's disconnected from our cognitive even. So Sanger and I, when we do our financial work for clients, one of the things we do, one of the very first things we do is go through a values exercise to help people understand their values, just like you articulated. Yours, mine are integrity, creativity, achievement, relationships, and excellence. And so I use those to reflect on the things that I'm doing, because I want to be aligned. I want to have my values aligned with my goals and my behavior aligned with those. So what have you found as people are studying, sort of making the values, tying their values to decision making? what have you guys learned in your work about how to best